I'm John Hayes. I'm a professor of physics at Queen Mary University of London and one of the project leads for this particular project. And I will show you our team in a second. So here's another, well, that doesn't look very bright, does it? The future is grey, I'm afraid. So these are literally just the objectives that Sophie showed before. So I won't go through those, but they're on the slide, so you can look at them at your leisure when we distribute the slides. Here's the project team as it sits at the moment. So there were 5 of us who were selected to be the lead team. So there's myself, we've got Sadaf, you want to wave, and Joe, who many of you will have been in contact via email, Adrian, sitting over there. And then we have Vasil, I think, is not here today. He'll be here tomorrow. And David is, oh, there you are. Yep, there's David. We've got our program manager, John. And then I'm going to butcher your name again, Rui is our community engagement officer. And we've got two posts that we're still in the process of filling, the most important of which that I want to talk about today is technical coordinator. We're also in the process of hiring an administrator. So just to pitch for this role, in case you are interested or you know someone who's interested, we are about to start recruitment on this. It's been a bit of a slog getting it through all the various hoops we have to do recruitment these days. This is a role that's a key member of the project team. They'll provide technical leadership with the lead team on the delivery of the roadmaps in particular. They'll be supporting the flexible funding call. They'll be part of the panel that's reviewing it. We'll have a good understanding of that. We're going to deliver a series of workshops that I'll tell you about in a minute. They'll be supporting that. But the key thing is that one of the things they need to do is to be driving that collection of evidence and putting it together and synthesizing the roadmaps out of that. So you're not doing it by yourself, but you will be working with the lead team. So that will be a primary part of that and the preparation of the roadmaps. And of course, building the relationships across the different UKRI communities, those other network pluses that Sophie was talking about and beyond. So in terms of federation, we've run a series, well, we haven't, but UKRI DRI program has run a whole series of workshops over the past couple of years where this theme has come up over and over again. And it occurred to me, well, what do we mean by federation? And if you ask 2 different people what they think federation is, you'll get 2 different answers. So I thought, well, I'll ask the people who know the Oxford English Dictionary. And apparently it is a country consisting of a group of individual states that have control over their own affairs, but are controlled by central government for national decisions. I think that doesn't apply. So thanks, Oxford English Dictionary. We're also not a group of clubs or trade unions, so that doesn't quite apply either. So then I thought, well, this is the modern age, I'll ask AI. So if you ask ChatGPT what a federated research network is, you get this actually quite reasonable definition, a decentralized system that enables multiple institutions, organizations, or researchers to collaborate while maintaining control over their own data and resources. And I think that just about fits what we're thinking about. Not to just pick one vendor of AI, I also went to Microsoft Copilot. A federated research network is a system that connects multiple, you can see it's the same sort of thing. So I think this is what we're talking about. And also we shouldn't think of federation as just one layer. Actually, we should be thinking about federations of federations of federations of federations. It can go as deep as necessary to get the job done. And so trying to put some shape to that, I came up with a pentagon. So there are sort of five concepts that came out of those definitions, and some of the ideas we got from participation in all these previous workshops. There's this idea of decentralization, that you have autonomous units that are agreeing to work together. And to work together, you need interoperability. So you need ways for those things. It can't just be, huge barriers if I'm working on one system and now need to move to another. You want that to work easily. There's the idea of autonomy, that these are separately funded, controlled units within a federation. You're not trying to centralize control of everything and have, one thing in charge of everything. Obviously, once you start sharing resources and opening things up, you're opening up attack surface for cyber attack and things like that. So you do need to pay attention to security and also privacy. You're not just protecting your data from those who are trying to attack, but also from people within the federation. Some of that data may need to be protected. And also you're looking to generate scalability. One of the benefits of it, which I'll talk about in a moment, is that you're not now restricted to your own autonomous unit. You collaborate with others to be able to scale up and take advantage. So sticking with the idea of 5 points, we can then look at what kind of benefits might there be to federation. So one, I think that for me is really important is accessibility. So that is the ability to use those large national resources and with minimum barriers to entry. Having worked in particle physics for too many years, I've run into this over and over again, that there is a resource out there that I could use, and being able to get a login, I have to jump through a bunch of bureaucratic hoops to get an identity, and then I get a login, and then moving data between them, et cetera, et cetera. They're all barriers to being able to make use of the resources that are available. By joining things up, you can gain efficiencies. You can share resources, move things around so that usage is maintained at the highest possible level. You never have idle resources if you've got that portability. You've got knowledge exchange. So we're all working in our different areas and doing our things, solving our own problems and meeting our own challenges. But we have shared challenges. We have things where some groups will have solved it in one way, other groups will solve it in another. Some may be struggling to solve their particular problems. By sharing through federation, we can then share those solutions and learn from each other to all do better. Of course, with security, by having that more joined up approach, we can be more joined up in our security, make sure that when a threat is discovered in one corner of the federation, we've got ways of communicating securely within that to others in the federation so that they can be aware of an arising threat or things like that. And there are examples of structures that already do this, but this is also something that should be built in there. And then finally, I've put resilience on there. By having multi-site, multi-organization resources, when one of those resources is not available, if we have that interoperability and portability, we can lose a little bit of capacity, but perhaps move some users over to other resources and gain resilience that way, that you don't go from 100% to zero when one component is down. And I think these are really important to think about, because we don't want to federate just to federate, just because it's fashionable or because we've got a warm fuzzy feeling about it. There have to be benefits, otherwise it's a waste of time and a waste of resource. And thinking about what Sophie was saying before about the participants in that federation, there was the dotted line looking at national resources. In order to meet that first point there of accessibility, you have to extend that dotted line out a little bit. And you see on Sophie's diagram, it was overlapping the other arrows to a certain extent. I need to be able to prototype on my laptop. And then perhaps as I scale it up to process data or do large computation, perhaps to a university scale resource. And then when I want to really scale it up, I go to a national large-scale compute resource. I need to be able to do that smoothly and without barriers to meet that first point. But in order for, say, the university to want to do that, there has to be a benefit in there. Joining Federation, putting those tools in place is not without a cost, right? There are services that will need to be there. There needs to be a business case, an understanding of how will that benefit. And it may be, my pool of users locally will get access to these resources and it will plug us into a bigger system. You've got to understand that benefit that you're getting from it before you commit people in your team to actually run those services, for example. Or it could be they're just paid for. There are lots of different sort of business cases and business models rather that can support that. That's one of the things we need to investigate during this project, to understand what those different those different business cases are. And I'll talk about that in a few minutes. So when we think about federation, I think previously we'd always talked about levels of federation. You can be loosely connected, more tightly connected, tightly bound. And as I was preparing this slide, I realized it's not really levels, it's elements, and that you can't put it into a neat hierarchy. Actually, what you have is almost a menu of services that allow you to connect and interoperate with others, and you need to pick the ones that fit that business model, that fit that user story, so that the people who are part of that user community of the federation, the people providing the services, that it all makes sense to do it and the benefits are realized. So I put some down on here that just, you know, off the top of my head, the sort of identity management, making sure we know who people are and whatever, and then being able to authenticate them to the system, the tooling and the services to be able to do that. The authorization, make sure they're allowed. We know who they are, make sure they're allowed to use those systems. There's elements of security. How do we build? So if one site gets hacked, the other sites are aware and we can make sure we're not vulnerable, or we can share intelligence around there. A more tighter level federation, you see, I slip into talking about levels automatically. It's so ingrained in how we've spoken about this. Another element is then accounting. So if we've got systems where we're supporting shared user bases, they will have been given an allocation on that service. We need to keep track of that. And if we're collaborating in that particular way, we may need to share information about who's used what so that we can make sure everybody's getting what they're supposed to. There are a whole series of services that may sit on top of that. That's a generic way of putting it, but it could be data services. It could be all kinds of things. There's software. So I'm not just running on a system. I need to have a way to get my software onto the system as a user of it. Software distribution, software tracking, etc. Make sure the software that's on there is the right software and hasn't been, I don't know, has not got malicious code in it. It ties back to security. So there are issues around that. Then data is particularly interesting. There are a lot of challenges in data sharing, moving data around and making sure we make optimum use of the resources that we've got. For a long time, there was, certainly thinking back 20 or 30 years ago, there was an idea the compute must sit next to the data. And back then, networks were great, but they were slow. And I remember colleagues that would go overseas to experiments and they'd come back with a bag full of tape because that was the highest bandwidth route to get your data back home. What was the saying? Never underestimate the bandwidth of a truck full of magnetic tape. It's really high bandwidth. It's just got big latency. These days, the networks are faster. And so one of my roles is science director of IRIS, and we deal with lots of different communities pulling together compute services in the areas of sort of particle physics, nuclear physics, astrophysics, and things around there. And I have people come to me, oh no, we must be on this system because we've got a large data set. And you say, okay, I understand. How big is your data? And they go, oh, it's a terabyte. And you go, okay, well, we can move that in about a second to anywhere you want because the networks are much faster. So absolutely, these issues exist about moving data and putting the compute and the data in the right places. But the scale is always changing. The networks are getting faster. We have an excellent academic network in this country, and we should be using it and not be stuck in a 20-year-old mindset of, well, I can't move the data. If it's 10 petabytes, then you've got a point. If it's 1 terabyte, you haven't. So pulling all of this together into a structure for this program, we identified three sort of pillars that tie back to those objectives and our thinking around this: community, policy, and technology. 3 pillars. So thinking about the first one of the objectives of the Network Plus is to build communities, get people talking to each other, and establish those relationships and links, not just across all the disciplines, but also within disciplines. Another thing I've observed is that we are all at different stages in that process of building those groupings across different disciplines. There are some are highly organized, they have annual meetings, they have separate user groups and whatever, it's highly organized. There are others which are growing and developing into that area where people don't know each other, they don't know whatever. So one of the things we want to do is around the idea of federated compute services, build communities and support people to build communities. So this means engaging with the stakeholders. And I mentioned earlier the idea of the user stories. This is really important, both for how to build community, but also then for establishing the roadmaps. We have to understand how users will interact with such a system. And there are a lot of different stories and a lot of different ways of accessing systems, different needs, different requirements. We need to capture that to make sure it's well represented in the roadmap and the recommendations that go in there. And the other thing that I have noticed, and I'm sure others have as well, is that when we're talking about these things, we use the same words, but they don't always have the same meanings. And we talk past each other sometimes because we think we're talking about the same thing, but we're getting at cross purposes. So another thing is, as part of that community building, is to try and establish common nomenclature or common understanding of what all these different components are. So in terms of technology, clearly we need the infrastructure and the tools. It's not just computers and hard drives to sit between users and the hardware to enable the federation, whether it's identity management tools, whether it's data movement, whatever. We need that technology to facilitate all of this and make it actually work. So one of the things we're aiming to do is to gather examples of the state of the art. What are we doing in all the different silos that exist across UKRI, DRI, and understand what people are doing, what are the tools that are out there, how suitable are they for other purposes, can they be repurposed, or are they just a good idea about how things can be done, but you have to retool because it's not quite transportable. And then evaluate those components and understand. One of the things we'd like to do is sort of have one or more reference stacks for the various services for federation. So, well, actually, if you want to put this together, the tools are out there. We don't need to develop stuff from scratch, but here's how you could hook them all up to put something together that will start to meet your requirements if you want a starting point to that. And then sort of as part of doing that, identify what are those core federation services. So I gave you the list of all the different things. We need to refine that a little bit and be a bit more specific and say, right, here are the different ways to be federated. Here are the tools that you will need to do it, or here are the types of tool that you will need to do it, the services that join it up, whether that be, identity services, data moving services, all those things that I mentioned before. And finally, another piece that I tend to find gets a little bit overlooked is that of policy and governance. And it's super, super important. Because if you're, let's say I'm running a cluster somewhere and I decide to join a federation and allow other people's users to come onto my system, I have to trust those people to do it. Now, I can do it in a centralized way where they have to fill out a form, they have to come visit me, I see a passport, I put it in a filing cabinet, I know who they are, I know where to find them when they do something wrong, I can send the police around or whatever's required. That's not really federating. That's very centralized and it puts a lot of barriers in the way. So if I'm going to trust you with your users on your system to come and use my system, we're going to have to come to an arrangement about how we're going to do that. And if it's just two of us, well, we can have a chat over coffee and work it out. But if it's more of us and it's a bigger federation, then we've got to put something down on paper, something which says how we agree we're going to operate, what are the rules of that interaction. And so if one of your users does something that they shouldn't, how do I know they've acted outside of policy? I've got an acceptable use policy. How do I shut them down when I don't know them, when I don't know who they are? What's our arrangement? And there are different ways of doing that. So one of the things we have to do is identify what are those aspects of policy that need defining, and they needn't be uniform and the same everywhere, but they need to fit the needs of the individual providers. They shouldn't put barriers in the way of the users, and they have to allow us to establish trust connections between the different nodes within within a federation so that we can work together knowing what our agreements are, how we've put it all together. And so I think what we'd like to do out of here as part of the roadmap is put together a framework that says these are the components. Now, again, we're not starting from scratch here. This is a well-trodden path by other federations and federating efforts around the world. But we need to take those, we need to look at them, make sure they're appropriate, and then we can just write them down, or if they're not, understand how they need to be changed to meet the needs of, the particular thing in this project. So that's the policy pillar. In terms of delivering all of this, we've the very crude flowchart here showing the feedback loop. My PowerPoint art is well-honed skill, clearly. At the top left there, we've got all the community engagement efforts. So this is an example of that. We've got this national meeting. We'll have a series of other national meetings. We'll be running a series of workshops. And an important component is we have a flexible funding pot to sponsor projects to feed into this process. So through these, we will generate the evidence we need for the roadmaps that we put it together to make sure the roadmaps are the best that we can do. It will also help us with the community building, and that will feed into that roadmap development process. And that's a feedback loop, right? That keeps going until we get closer to the end of the project. At some point, we will have a near final draft of the roadmap, and that will then go out for community consultation. We're currently planning to do a series of sort of road shows where we'll go around and run short meetings and webinars to just engage with that and get people's feedback on it to make sure it's serving everybody's needs, and then that will lead to the final output in terms of the roadmaps. So those components, we got the national meetings. So we're currently planning for 4 national meetings during the course of the project, including this one, where we want to really get a broad engagement across the community, share our progress on the project as we're going along, and encourage that community building, knowledge exchange, and all those sort of things, and the networking, but at that broad, higher level, at sort of the top of the project. We're also planning to start a series of themed workshops. So these will be structured around those 3 pillars, where we'll look at very specific topics and try and get smaller groups together. These will likely all be just online. And this is focusing on that knowledge exchange. When we have funded projects in those various themes, this will be a way for those projects to meet together to give progress updates within the pillar, so we understand what everybody's doing, and facilitate communication and interactions between projects and between the project team. Yeah. And then the flexible funding call. So we've got approximately £2 million available to support projects that go towards the objectives of the Network Plus. These are all funded at the usual 80% FEC, and the maximum length will be 1 year. So this is just the length of the project means that's the longest that we can do, because we need outputs from the project that then feed into the roadmaps. So that will give us a little bit of time at the end to incorporate the final outputs of a project. So in order to create a balanced portfolio of projects, we're dividing this up into the pillars and into sort of 3 approximate levels of funding. So small projects, they would typically be less than 10K. So the idea of these is that they will support things like community meetings or workshops, where it can go towards cost of a venue or the organizational effort needed to put it together. So it's small, but this is, let's say you have a community and you say, right, we want to put together what are our user stories and requirements for federation. Then you could arrange a meeting within your community to do that. That's the kind of thing that would fit there. Or it may be you're branching out across communities and you say, well, we know these communities are already organizing. How do we bring them together? You may want to do something like that. And again, to put together evidence that can feed into the roadmaps. Then we have slightly larger projects. And here what we're thinking is this will largely be covering staff time to actually do some work, to go out there. And it could be surveying landscapes, so saying, right, we want to go off and look at federation in this particular area, and we want to put together a report that will feed in as evidence to the roadmap, for example. Or it could be looking at short technical projects where you look at perhaps there's some established technology for doing it in one area and you want to evaluate it for use within UKRI DRI and generate evidence there that says, well, here are examples. And then large projects, which will be less than 200K, where this might be covering, a full FTE for a year to go. These will likely be a bit more of the technical evaluation projects or much bigger surveys or community activities there. These are not strict guidelines. These are examples. If you can demonstrate it's going to lead to the producing good evidence for the roadmaps or building community aligned with the objectives, then it will be a good proposal. So to say a bit more about that, so a good proposal will demonstrate a very clear alignment with the project and will identify which of the pillars, more than one is perfectly fine, it associates with, and it has to have clear and achievable objectives that align with the goals of the Network Plus. So that's essentially community building or evidence for the roadmaps. Obviously, all the costs need to be justified and identified how they will support the delivery of the objectives of the project. And we're also, because of the cross-disciplinary nature of this, we also want to see an appropriate level of cross-disciplinary engagement for the activity being proposed. So if you're looking for £5,000 to run a one-day workshop that will bring together people in a single community, we want to see, is that breadth appropriate for what you're trying to achieve? Right, we're not saying everybody has to have somebody from every corner of UKRI. It has to be scoped appropriately for the project, and we'll be judging panels on that. If you come along and say, in my narrow discipline, I want to have £200,000 for two people to develop a technological solution to a challenge we have in our field, you're not going to get it, right? That's too narrow. It's too focused on solving your own problem and not on contributing to the Network Plus. So the kind of activities, I've covered most of this, but I'll just go through it again quickly. I've got a few minutes left. Things like surveys of existing practice are very useful to get. Assessing gaps in existing provision, could be hardware, software, training, services, whatever. Assessment of barriers to entry and onboarding. So again, this is all part of that generating community requirements type activity. Also technical evaluation of existing or prototype solutions. We are limited to funding projects like that are TRL 4 or lower. For those of you that means something to TRL 4 or lower. These are not research grants. They're not for conducting research in the sense of generating, new knowledge insights. It's rather there's a blurred line at the edge there. So do bear that in mind and get in touch with us if you're putting together a proposal, so we can give you some feedback on it and say, well, actually, if you phrased it in these terms, then perhaps we can fund that. But the way you've written it, it sounds too much like a research project. So we're happy to give feedback on that. And this is not an exclusive list. Anything that supports the goals of the Network Plus will be considered. So do think about that. And of course, we're here for these 2 days if you want to discuss any of it with us, and you can drop us an email if you want more information. So next to last slide. So this is the launch for our Network Plus. We've got a series of talks. We've got 2 interactive sessions. We've got one today and one tomorrow, where we're going to ask for your input on the project. Of course, feel free to grab us in the coffee breaks and have a chat. There are some really good opportunities there with the funding available. Remind you, the recruitment for the technical coordinator is about to go live. That will be announced through all the usual channels. There's my and Sadaf's email on there, but we also have an announcement mailing list. So if you scan that code on the left, that will take you to the subscription page for that mailing list. If you can't use that, just contact us and we can add you manually. And also we've put up a draft of the funding call document. This is not final. It may yet change as we finalize it. But if you want to have a look and think about it, we welcome your feedback. If you look at that and you say, well, I've got a great idea that would be really important for this project, but the way you've written the funding call means I can't do it, then we'd love to have your feedback so that we can make sure there are no gaps and nobody's ruled out from participation. Okay, thanks very much.
Questions before we go to questions in the room. I don't know if you've got any questions online.
So the question is, could you please explain how to fund is distributed time-wise, i.e. half every month or question mark?
I think we're flexible in that in the end, we will, you propose the timeline and the profile and we will fund it there. What's important for us is the total amount and the justification of the costs, and that it fits within the timeline. So if it's 0.2 for 6 months, that's fine. If it's 0.1 for 1 month and then 0.1 in another month, we're not too bothered about those details. We will provide you with the total amount, and all of this will be done through research collaboration agreements. And so I think that'll operate on like a quarterly reclaim, but I don't know the financial details, the technical details of that.
Okay. Questions?
Hi, John. Thank you. This is Karina from the University of Brighton. I just had a question around the issue of community. So I work with the arts and humanities communities, which currently do not have a lot of access to DRI.
Right.
So when it comes to making arguments about what is their current use and, all of these things, I kind of start thinking, how do we tell that story when there is not much there? It's about digging out evidence of very kind of siloed, I guess, access and tools. So I guess my question goes around how much cross-disciplinary, interdisciplinary you are seeking in these projects, because at the end, if the federated infrastructure still follows a community approach, you will end up with the same silos just being replicated in new ways, right? So I'm just want to get your vision as to how do you break those silos going forward?
I think we have to take an incremental approach because it's silos all the way down. Right. So in a community that is not yet kind of self-organizing, each institute has its own silo. And so a project there that pulls those institutes together and people within a discipline is already that incremental step forward. And so this is what I was saying earlier about it being appropriate to the project suggested. But let's say you already have disciplinary organization where you have people at different institutes who are already collaborating, and then you have an adjacent discipline where they're already collaborating, but they don't talk to each other, and they could interact and they could benefit through federation, then that would be a project, and that would be the next step, and so on. I think if we go for everybody has to be at that big level, then different communities are at different stages and it just doesn't work. So the idea is to be flexible. And if it's a community, again, where everybody's working in their own little, team at an institution, then it is entirely appropriate to propose a project that draws them together and establishes, for example, a set of community requirements. What are the barriers for that community being able to access large-scale compute? And what's their need, and what would they like it to look like? If they're not using it now, how might they want to use it in the future? Yeah. Oh, sorry, you're Jen.
Can I just ask a question on timing?
Yes.
So what's the length of this project and the road? And I'll ask the whole question, then you can answer the whole thing. So what's the length of this project and the roadmaps that you're generating? How dependent on the outcome of those roadmaps is the future of UK computing and capability? Because in the slides presented earlier by Sophia, it kind of it seems to infer that what happens next is dependent on the roadmap. So I'm just trying to understand the timing of all of these things. And
Yeah, I mean,
what
that
the
might be a
impact-
question for Sophie. So just before I hand it over to Sophie, this project is only a 2-year project, and we're already quite a way into it. The funding started in October. So we've now done all the setup and are launching it. So we need the final bits of evidence by next summer. So that sets a timescale there to have roadmaps done by the end of the project. But I think the way the DRI will happen is we will have intermediate outputs that we will feed into that are non-final, and just to, kind of marry the two separate processes together. But I think we're not starting from scratch here. It's not like the DRI has just been invented and we're just doing it. There's an awful lot of inertia there and things going on. You saw the huge set of things that they're funding. So I don't know if you want to add.
I'm not quite sure if I can add much to that. I mean, we're also in the spending review period as well, which I mentioned. So I think to some degree, we're kind of waiting on the outputs of that to then see the scale of what we can do in the future. This isn't the only activity, I guess, which is informing the evolution of the DRI as well. So I mentioned we've got these 36 projects, and we're also informed by things which aren't funded by the programme. So yeah, it's a case of knitting things together, I think, but this is a crucial part of that. Hope that helps to answer your question.
Yeah.
So one from online again, can we talk about EDI for the fairness, inclusiveness aspects?
In the context of the projects, is that?
I assume so.
Yeah. I mean, I think we follow all our standard, well-established procedures for that, of trying to make sure that we don't put barriers in there for participation for anybody, whether that's with protected characteristics or otherwise. And I'm hoping that through the series of meetings and announcements and building out the network, we can also make sure that the broadest number of people are aware of the program and how to participate, and that we won't be we'll be very clear on the procedures when we're evaluating proposals, for example, to make sure that we control our unconscious biases and things like that. So it's not all a bunch of senior professors get all the funding, etc. So we put no limits other than those put on us by UKRI on who can participate and who can apply for funding. It's not, yeah. Hopefully that's some way helpful.
Yeah, they said thanks.
You mentioned earlier about the user stories. I just wonder if you could elaborate what you mean, what they would look like, who would use them, what's their purpose?
So the idea of the user stories is understanding what do the requirements on a useful, accessible, interoperable federation, what does it look like to the user? What are their requirements focused around how they would interact with it? So I guess that's what I mean by a user story. So it could be a description of, in a very detailed way of, right, here's a large scale compute system. What do I need to do to interact with it? And what are my requirements? And then we can look at those and make them a bit more generic for a particular class of users with a particular set of requirements, and hopefully use that to make sure that we don't, propose a series of recommendations that mean such a federation is of no use to certain groups of users. So that's that's it. Cool.
Can I just add?
Yep.
And user here is almost think of it as a role. So a user is an end user of an infrastructure, but a user could be someone who is defining a policy, or a user could be someone who is a service provider, or users could be someone who is allocator or capacity manager.
Yeah.
So when we write user stories about federation, you can say, what is the role? Of course, researchers are the center of these things. So the user story is about how do I manage capacity, or how do I roll out, or John, you mentioned this idea about incident management in the context of cybersecurity. So a user story could come from someone doing compliance and regulatory work in the case of federation.
Yeah.
So user story is about defining, I am this person, how do I do this? Not necessarily. Thanks.
Jeremy?
I have to admit, my heart sank a bit when you referred to research collaboration agreements. Given the rather negative experience of
Not my choice.
Yeah. Given the rather negative experience that most of us have had with them, how are you going to make sure that these agreements are accepted by the lawyers quickly, and which means you're going to have to manage that process very interactively,
Yes.
because that's the only way any of us have got them to work, is to put time into it. So I'm just asking if the project is going to make sure that you're going to put effort into making sure that this gets done, and the lawyers get chivied and the research officers get chivied to get these things signed, because they don't like hiring people until they've got them signed. And that's the problem with them. So I just thought I'd raise that.
No, I have similar experiences, but the way the funding is provided, that is the only route to do it. So we have some fairly standardized contracts in hand that we have already gone through a couple of loops with in establishing the funding for the lead teams, the lead team members, and certainly we haven't got them all finished yet. There's a couple left to do, but the ones we have done, the changes requested by the lawyers have been actually very easy to accept and very, very minor. They get a bit hung up on the intellectual property bit, but we're not generating any intellectual property other than a report that you willingly submit. So from our side, we go, yeah, whatever.
It's not the changes I'm worried about.
Yeah.
It's how long it takes.
Yeah.
It can take months.
Yeah.
So
Could I add to that question? Do you expect the proposal will come from one institution and have partners? Because it goes to your collaboration agreement question. One, you say, okay, let's involve 5, 6 institutions because all of them have good complete services, then it gets a bit more complicated. What do you expect?
It will be complicated. So we anticipate multiple institutes per proposal. Okay. The collaborators will nominate a lead who will do that, but we will issue research collaboration agreements to each participant. And so we'll make very clear in the guidance when it's ready to circulate exactly what information we need. It's fairly straightforward. There are sort of 5 headings where you've got to put a number in. This is what this costs. This is what this costs. This is what this costs, and whatever in terms of the detail. But what we will do is circulate a draft agreement with those numbers already in, which will have come from the proposal, one to each member of that collaboration, and then they need to turn it around as fast as they can. Unfortunately, I can't go to somebody else's university research office and I mean, maybe I can, maybe we should, but personally say, look, can we get this done? But what we will do is John here will be managing that process, and we'll be in touch with the individual research officers.
But I think my question goes also for the staff costing. You don't expect staffs to be costed across 5 or 6 universities, right? Or is that unexpected? I mean, you talk about your different levels, right? I mean, if it's 5 organizations to do a workshop, it's not feasible. But if it goes to the medium or the large, are you expecting there will be a percentage of staff?
I think the only way to do it is either have one institute get all the money, and then it's up to you how you arrange it, if you can do that. But that puts, you've basically then got to issue your own research collaboration agreements, and we've just pushed it down one level. If you want to do that, that's better for us. we were anticipating nobody would want to do that.
Mhm.
In which case we would then be that coordinating body where, let's say there's 5 institutes and you want 0.2, 0.2, 0.2, 0.2, 0.2, we need to know the cost for each one. We will write that cost into an individual research agreement that will be mailed out to each institute. It'll go to their research office and then they have to sign it before we can issue the funds.
So the agreement will be signed with Queen Mary, yeah? That
Yeah, we hold the funds.
Okay.
That's the way it works with the funds are issued by EPSRC, and that was their preferred way of working.
Could I also ask not the different question, and it's about users don't know what they don't know, right? So if we get together people and say, what would you like a federated service? They will go like, well, they can come up. But you mentioned before, we know there are good examples, maybe in other countries, maybe, I don't know how much you have done the scoping to understand what looks like a good model. I know some virtual research environments, but again, I don't know when I have tried to envisage how this looks like the user, whether you envisage something but it will be useful for us to know whether you have done that scoping. There are good examples. We can kind of draw inspiration from some of these.
So others have done that kind of scoping, and I think some of the things that Sophie pointed to, you can find resources where people have done that. There are a lot of examples in the JISC report, for example. We have not yet done that kind of scoping. So I think one of the areas that'll be interesting is through the workshops, where people can then come along and see in a particular area, oh, this is what other people are doing. And in the second of these events later this year, I'm hoping we'll have a bit more of a showcase there, but we'll see some things in the talks we've got today and tomorrow that are examples of, they're at very different levels, very different areas of how these things can work. But I think the basics for me are, it really comes down to identity, comes down to authentication, authorization, and what was the other one I was trying to think of? Things around allocation and shared services. So if you're thinking about portability of workloads, those sort of things I think are really the essence. There's a ton of stuff you can do extra, but those are the core areas in my mind. Yep, Sadafia.
So I will add, I think this is an excellent question. So one of the things I would really appreciate, you send this question. I mean, we will capture questions and we will run survey, but also to our inquiries email, because I think, so all of us came together from different background, but of course, we have some background, let's just put it that way, but we do not represent the widest community possible. And this is just really very important that we capture these cases, and then we have some resources. So as John said, we have some speakers here, which you will hear, but that is just gives you some evidence and indication. So I would really like your question to be there, because depending on your community, there are some examples in the UK and internationally. However, me saying it right now, it's one thing, but we would really like to display in a proper way, okay, these are the list of resources that could be, and then we could create like a knowledge base or source, which potential people who can apply.
So just to interject there, the end of today and the end of tomorrow, we're doing just a 1 hour discussion session. I think maybe it's an hour and a half tomorrow. So I think today it's more on the getting input from the people who are here and online around what are the challenges that you see engaging with the project, and whatever, to understand if there's something we could change and do better, or to help you or your communities or people, I don't know, that you may know who are not here, but you can ask on their behalf to sort of give us some feedback, and maybe we can change things to enable that enhanced engagement. I think we're about to time now, so.
Brilliant. Thanks, John.